You knew who she was the day she knocked on our door, didn't you? When Cassandra Vale moved in across the street and knocked on Mara and Daniel's door, asking to borrow a blender, Mara thought nothing of it. Neighbors borrow things. But Daniel's jaw tightened in a way Mara had never seen before, and the blender was never returned. Over the next 3 months, Mara watched her husband grow distant, watched Cassandra appear at precisely the wrong moments, and watched a silence build between them that felt less like a secret and more like a wall. When Daniel finally confessed, what he admitted was not an affair, it was something older, stranger, and in many ways, more devastating. And the woman across the street was not the villain Mara had prepared herself to confront. She was something far more complicated. This is the story of what Mara did with that truth, and what it cost her to find it. The sugar she never needed. The blender had been sitting on Mara's kitchen counter since the previous Christmas, still in its original box. A gift from her mother-in-law that arrived with a recipe card for green smoothies that Mara had never once followed. She kept meaning to donate it. She kept not donating it. So when the woman from across the street knocked on the front door on a Tuesday morning in September and asked in a voice like warm caramel poured slowly whether by any chance Mara had a blender she could borrow, Mara laughed and said yes, absolutely, come in, and pulled the box from the cabinet under the counter with genuine relief that it was finally going to be useful to someone. The woman introduced herself as Cassandra Vale. She was maybe 32, 33, with dark hair cut just below her chin, and the kind of effortless posture that made Mara stand up a little straighter without meaning to. She wore a linen shirt the color of sand and carried a canvas tote bag with a farmer's market logo on the side. And she smiled at Mara with an openness that felt both genuine and practiced, the way people smile when they have decided to be likable and are very good at it. "I just moved in last week," Cassandra said, looking around the entryway with a curiosity that she didn't bother to hide. "The house across the street, the gray one with the bad shutters. I'm still figuring out what the kitchen has and what it doesn't." "The Hendersons' place," Mara said, because she still thought of it that way, even though the Hendersons had moved to Scottsdale 8 months ago, and the house had sat empty ever since. "It's a good house. The kitchen's actually bigger than it looks from outside." That's what the real estate agent said. Cassandra's eyes drifted briefly to the gallery wall in the hallway. Framed photos, a wedding portrait, a shot from a trip to Maine 2 summers ago, a candid of Daniel laughing at something off camera. Her gaze lingered there for 2 beats longer than was natural, then came back to Mara with a clean, easy smile. "You have a beautiful home." "Thank you. It's a work in progress." Mara set the blender box on the counter. "I'm a designer, so I'm always finding something else to change. My husband says I treat the house like a client that never fires me." Cassandra laughed at that. A real laugh surprised short. "That's a very good line." Mara handed over the box and told her to keep it as long as she needed. Cassandra thanked her and said she'd return it within the week, and they made the loose, friendly small talk of 2 women who had just met and were deciding whether they wanted to know each other better. Cassandra said she worked remotely, something in financial consulting. She was a bit vague about the details, in a way that didn't feel suspicious so much as the natural vagueness of someone who found their own work boring to explain. She said she liked the neighborhood. She said the coffee shop on Elm was better than it looked. She said she hoped they would be friends. She left after 11 minutes. Mara counted afterward, not because she was suspicious, but because she was on a deadline for a client presentation and had been tracking the morning in chunks of productivity. She stood at the window for a moment and watched Cassandra cross the street with the blender box tucked under one arm, moving with an unhurried certainty, like someone who knew exactly where she was going and had decided not to rush. Then Mara went back to her drafting table and forgot about it. She did not forget about Daniel's face when he came home that evening. He came in at 6:15, which was normal, dropped his keys on the hook by the door, which was normal, and called out her name as he walked toward the kitchen, which was also normal. What was not normal was the half-second pause when he stepped into the kitchen and found Mara standing at the counter on the phone, facing the window that looked directly across the street at the gray house with the bad shutters, where a light had come on in the upstairs room, and a silhouette moved slowly behind thin curtains. The pause was small enough that Mara almost didn't catch it. Almost. He recovered instantly, poured himself a glass of water, asked how her day went, pulled out his phone to check something. The full sequence of a man arriving home with nothing on his mind. But Mara had spent 12 years designing spaces for people reading, how they moved through rooms, what they looked at, and what they deliberately didn't look at. And she had learned that the body tells the truth, even when the face is lying. Daniel had not looked at the window. He had walked to the refrigerator, which was on the other side of the kitchen, which meant he had to actively choose not to look at the window. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that meant nothing, and also sometimes meant everything. A woman moved in across the street, Mara said, still on hold with her supplier, turning away from the window. She came by this morning to borrow the blender. Cassandra Vale. Daniel was looking at his phone. She seems nice. I told her she could keep it for the week. Sure, Daniel said. Then, after a pause that was perhaps a half-second too long, she's the one with the gray house? Yeah, the Henderson's place. He nodded, looking at his phone. His jaw, she noticed, was set in a particular way, not tight exactly, but held the way people hold their faces when they are concentrating on keeping their expressions neutral. She had seen that look before, and she had always associated it with work stress, with a difficult client, with the specific tension of a man who was carrying something he hadn't decided yet whether to put down. She moved in last week, apparently, Mara added. Daniel said. And then the supplier picked up and Mara turned back to her call. And by the time she was done, Daniel had started dinner, and the moment had passed, the way moments do when you are not sure if they were moments at all. That night after dinner, after the dishes, after the comfortable television routine that had become the soundtrack of their evenings, she worked on a floor plan. He read. They talked about small things, the neighbor's tree that kept dropping branches, whether to repaint the guest room, whether his mother was actually going to visit in October, or just threatened to. After all of that, Mara went to Daniel's home office to borrow the charger that lived on his desk, because hers was somewhere in the bedroom, and she was too tired to look. She opened the desk drawer for the charger and saw the envelope. It was a standard legal-size envelope, white, with the return address printed in the upper left corner in small navy type. Hargrove and Associates, attorneys at law, with an address in downtown Philadelphia. The envelope was already opened, the flap tucked back in. Mara saw it for perhaps 3 seconds before her hand found the charger and she closed the drawer without touching the envelope or looking any longer. She stood in the office for a moment. Daniel was in the other room. The television murmured through the wall. Hargrove and Associates. She didn't know that name. Daniel handled his own work correspondence and the occasional document from their accountant, but those came addressed to both of them. This had been addressed only to Daniel. She had seen that much in 3 seconds. She told herself it was nothing, a work matter, a routine legal question about a contract or a property issue. Daniel's company dealt with vendors and lease agreements regularly enough that correspondence from a law firm was not inherently alarming. She told herself this, and mostly she believed it. And she went back to the living room and sat beside her husband and watched him read, and thought about how the light in the upstairs window of the gray house across the street had stayed on until past midnight, because she had seen it when she got up for water, and she had not been able to explain why that seemed like something she needed to remember. Cassandra Vale had not returned the blender by the end of the week. Mara noticed but didn't mention it. People forgot things. Neighbors borrowed things and got busy and forgot. It was not a sign of anything. She repeated this to herself on Friday evening, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, watching the gray house sit quiet and ordinary in the early autumn light, the shutters casting long shadows across the front walk, the kind of shadows that looked like something reaching. The coffee went cold. Mara poured it out and went back to work. The first time Mara used the phrase, "our neighbor Cassandra," in conversation, Daniel changed the subject within 2 sentences, she noticed. She filed it under the same category as the jaw set and the window avoidance, a behavior that could mean nothing, that probably meant nothing, that she was choosing for now to simply note and hold and not yet act upon. It was the third week of September. The neighborhood had shifted into that particular early fall register Mara loved. The air still warm enough for short sleeves in the afternoon, but with an edge to the mornings that made the coffee taste better. The light going golden earlier, the maples on their street beginning to think about changing. She had a major presentation coming up for a client in Westchester, a full renovation of a Victorian farmhouse that the client kept describing as wanting to feel authentically lived in but still elevated, which was the kind of brief that sounded poetic until you had to actually execute it. Mara had been working late spreading fabric samples across the dining room table and arguing with herself about whether the client's preferred palette of warm whites and clay tones would read as intentional or simply unfinished against the original wide plank floors. It was in this context, busy, distracted, not looking for anything, that she began to see the pattern. Cassandra brought over a bottle of olive oil on a Tuesday afternoon. She said she'd picked up an extra one at the farmer's market and thought Mara might like it. And they stood at the door and talked for about 15 minutes about the renovation project, about the neighborhood, about Cassandra's apparent preference for cooking elaborate meals for one person, which she described with a self-deprecating humor that Mara found genuinely charming. But toward the end of the conversation, casually, almost as an afterthought, Cassandra asked whether Daniel was working on anything interesting lately. Mara said he was in the middle of a corporate restructuring project for a manufacturing client. Not confidential information, the kind of thing you say about a spouse's work to be polite. Cassandra nodded and said, "He seems like someone who would be good at that." Very methodical. Mara had no idea how Cassandra would know anything about Daniel's methodology. They had spoken exactly once, briefly, when Daniel had come to the door to say hello while Cassandra was visiting, and it had been a short, unremarkable exchange. "How are you settling in?" "The neighborhood is quiet, but there's good restaurants on Elm. Nice to meet you." 3 minutes at most. She didn't say this. She smiled and agreed, and after Cassandra left, she stood in the kitchen and turned the olive oil bottle in her hands and thought about how you describe someone's personality from a 3-minute interaction, and decided that you couldn't not with that kind of specificity, not unless you had more information than a 3-minute interaction would give you. The olive oil was very good. That felt somehow like the most unsettling detail. On a Thursday the following week, Mara was in the backyard with her laptop when she heard Cassandra's voice from the front of the house. She went around to the side gate and looked through. Cassandra was standing on the sidewalk talking to Daniel, who had arrived home perhaps 20 minutes earlier than Mara expected, and had apparently encountered Cassandra by the mailbox. Mara watched for a moment through the gap in the gate. They were not standing close. There was nothing physically intimate about the scene, but they were talking with the particular quality of two people who were being careful, heads slightly angled toward each other, voices low, the sentences short and clipped, the way sentences get when you're aware of being possibly observed. Daniel's hands were in his pockets, which was what he did when he was guarding himself. Cassandra had her arms crossed, which was what people did when they were braced. When Daniel looked up and saw Mara walking around the corner, his expression shifted. Relief, she thought, first, and then realized it was something more complicated. It was the face of someone who had been interrupted, and wasn't sure if that was good or bad. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Mara said. "I didn't hear you pull in." "Got out early," he said. "Just ran into..." He gestured vaguely toward Cassandra. "Hi, Mara." Cassandra smiled, easy and natural. If she felt any tension, she did not show it. "I was just asking Daniel about the parking situation, whether there's any issue with guests parking on the street overnight. I have a friend coming to visit." "No issue at all," Mara said. "The street's public. Park anywhere." "Great, thanks." Cassandra held her gaze for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction there was something, not guilt exactly, but something alert, something that was actively measuring. Then it was gone, and she said goodnight and walked back across the street, and Mara and Daniel went inside, and he made pasta carbonara and she told him about the client's palate crisis, and they watched an episode of something on television that neither of them would have been able to describe the next morning. But in the kitchen, while Daniel was boiling water, Mara picked up her phone and opened a browser and typed, "Cassandra Vale, Philadelphia." Nothing. She tried Cassandra Vale Financial Consultant. A LinkedIn profile with a professional photo, very limited information visible without connecting. A summary that said she worked in financial analysis, currently independent. No company listed. No education listed as public. Connections 31. It was a sparse profile. The profile of someone who maintained it to exist rather than to communicate. She tried Cassandra Vale. A few entries, a race registration from a 10K in Chicago 3 years ago. A comment on a community board in Evanston. A brief mention in a local newspaper article about a charity event. All recent. Nothing before 4 years ago. No childhood photos anywhere. No college tagging. No family connections visible on any platform. No history that would show you who she'd been before the last 4 years. Which was unusual. Most people's digital footprints, even the private ones, reached back further than that without deliberate effort. The absence of earlier history wasn't impossible, but it was the kind of absence that required either a very private personality or a very conscious choice. Mara closed the browser. She set her phone down. She told herself she was looking for a problem where there wasn't one, that she was letting work stress metastasize into domestic suspicion, that she was the kind of person who could find a menacing pattern in a grocery list if she was tired enough. She almost believed it. On the last Friday of September, Mara was upstairs in the guest room comparing paint swatches against the afternoon light. Always the most unforgiving light. The light that showed you the true color and didn't allow for any comfortable approximations. When she heard Daniel's voice from his office down the hall. Low. Careful. The particular cadence of someone who was keeping their volume down on purpose. She did not move to the hallway. She was not the kind of woman who pressed her ear to doors. But the guest room shared a thin plaster wall with the hallway, and the hallway carried sound in ways that the rest of the house did not. And so she heard, without intending to, the 3 words that Daniel said before she heard him shift and lower his voice further. "Cass, not now." She stood very still with a paint swatch in each hand. Not Cassandra. Cass. You called someone Cass when you knew them well enough to shorten their name without asking. You called someone Cass when that name had been in your mouth long enough to wear down to its smallest form. You called someone Cass when you had a history with the sound of their name. Mara set the paint swatches down on the windowsill very carefully, both of them face down, as if she were putting something fragile to bed. She went downstairs and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray house across the street until the feeling in her chest settled from something sharp into something flatter and more manageable. The feeling of a suspicion that had not yet hardened into certainty, but had moved decisively closer to it. She did not confront Daniel. Not yet. She needed, she told herself, to understand what she was confronting before she confronted it. Otherwise, she would be asking the wrong questions, and wrong questions invited usable answers, answers that could be technically true and entirely misleading. And Mara had built her professional life on the principle that you never walked into a reveal without understanding the room first. That weekend, she drove to her office and used her work computer, out of some instinct she couldn't fully articulate, to access the home security system's stored footage. They had installed the camera at the front door 18 months ago, after a series of package thefts in the neighborhood. A wide-angle device that covered the porch, the front walk, and most of the street. It stored 30 days of footage before overwriting. She had 30 days. She pulled up the morning of September 9th, the morning Cassandra had come to borrow the blender. She watched herself open the door, watched Cassandra step inside, watched the exchange, the box being handed over, Cassandra's brief smile at the camera angle. She must not have noticed it. Or maybe she had. It was hard to tell. Then Mara backed up. She went to the footage from the day before, September 8th, and then the day before that, and then September 6th, the day the moving truck had appeared in front of the gray house. On September 6th, at 4:17 in the afternoon, Daniel's car was parked in front of the house, and Daniel was standing on the sidewalk, talking to a woman in a linen shirt. The woman was Cassandra. They talked for 11 minutes by the footage timestamp, and at no point did either of them look at each other the way strangers look at each other, with that slight formality, that careful mirroring of poses that happens when people are calibrating social distance. They stood 3 feet apart, turned slightly toward each other, and whatever they were saying, both of them looked unmistakably like people who had met before. Daniel had not mentioned this conversation. He had not said, "Oh, by the way, I met our new neighbor," when the truck pulled up. He had allowed Mara's account of Cassandra's visit, said with the warmth of introducing something new, to stand without correction. Mara saved a screenshot of the timestamp. She saved one of the footage still. She closed the program and sat for a while in her empty office and looked at the city outside the window and thought, with the careful, methodical precision she applied to every complicated project, about where to go from here. Not to Daniel. Not yet. Not without more. She typed Hargrove & Associates Philadelphia into her work browser. The firm's website loaded. Corporate and estate law. Founded 1987. 3 senior partners. The third name listed was Marcus Hargrove, estate litigation specialist, with a photograph, a man in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of polished that came from 40 years of billing at a premium rate. Estate litigation. Mara looked at that phrase for a long time. Then she wrote it in the small notebook she kept in her bag for client notes, underneath the fabric supplier phone number and the paint code for the client's dining room. And she closed the browser and drove home. What the walls remember. October arrived the way it always did in that part of Pennsylvania, abruptly, as if someone had turned a dial overnight from warm to sharp. The maples on their street went gold and amber and rust over the course of about 4 days, and Mara spent a Saturday morning raking leaves into piles that the wind immediately scattered, which she found both annoying and, in some structural sense, comforting. Some things were exactly as chaotic as they appeared. No hidden layer, no second meaning. Just wind and leaves and entropy working the way they were supposed to. Daniel raked with her for 20 minutes, then went inside to take a call. She watched him go without comment. She had developed over the course of the past month a system. Not a confrontational system, not a surveillance system. She resisted calling it either of those things in her own mind because both felt like violations of something she still wanted to protect. It was more like what she did with a difficult space when you didn't understand why a room wasn't working. You sat in it at different times of day and you paid attention without trying to solve anything yet. You let the room show you where the problem was. You waited. Daniel came home within the same half-hour window every weekday, so she had stopped noting that. But twice more in October, she saw Cassandra step out of her front door within minutes of Daniel's car appearing on the street. And twice more the conversations happened on the sidewalk, brief but contained, always ending before Mara reached the door. Whether Cassandra's timing was coincidence or something else, Mara had no way to measure. The camera only captured what was directly in front of the house. The sidewalk was at the edge of the frame. What she could measure was the change in Daniel. It was not dramatic. He had not become a different person. He still made her laugh at dinner, still remembered to pick up her dry cleaning on Thursdays, still rubbed the back of her neck when she was hunched over her drafting table too long. The intimacy was intact. That was what made it harder. If he had withdrawn from her entirely, she would have had something solid to point to, a clear, negative space. Instead, he was present and warm, and also somewhere, behind his eyes, somewhere in the set of his shoulders, in the mornings, carrying something that he had not told her about. She had always been good at reading rooms. She was learning that people were rooms too. She had done more research on Hargrove & Associates in the 3 weeks since she'd looked up the firm. She'd been careful about it. Work computer logged out of personal accounts, the kind of deliberate separation that she told herself was just professional habit, and not an acknowledgement that she was worried about something. She found that the firm specialized specifically in contested estate claims, inheritance disputes, challenges to wills, the intricate legal machinery that activated when someone died with complicated assets and more complicated family. It was not the kind of firm you contacted about a corporate lease agreement. It was the kind of firm you contacted when someone's family was fighting over what they'd been left. Daniel's father had died 14 months ago. She had been at the funeral. A quiet service in Connecticut, just a handful of people. Walter Whitmore had been, by all accounts, a man who kept his circle deliberately small. Daniel's mother had died years earlier. The relationship between Daniel and his father had been, in Mara's experience of it, civil, but not warm. The relationship of a son who had learned early that proximity to his father required a particular kind of careful behavior, and who had mostly chosen distance as the easier alternative. Mara had met Walter Whitmore 3 times in 8 years of knowing Daniel. He had been polite to her and careful with information the way people are when they have decided what they will and won't share and have made their peace with the distinction. Daniel had said once early in their relationship, when she'd asked about his father's emotional unavailability in the tentative way you probe a partner's old wounds in the beginning. He had other obligations. I understood that eventually. Other obligations. She had read that phrase at the time as a gentle euphemism for work, for a career that consumed more than a father's fair share of attention and left children with the feeling of being scheduled rather than loved. She had stored it in the category of understandable explanations for family distance, the category where she kept Daniel's slight difficulty with vulnerability and his habit of withdrawing into logistics when conversations became emotional. She sat with the phrase differently now. The second Saturday of October, she was in her car getting ready to drive to a tile supplier when she saw Cassandra come out of the gray house carrying a box, books, it looked like, and loaded into her car. She did this with the efficient, unsentimental energy of someone who had long since made peace with moving with the impermanence of spaces. Mara watched for a moment, and then before she had fully decided, picked up her phone and searched Cassandra Vale Whitmore. The result was a single entry buried in the results, a 2-paragraph article from a community newspaper in suburban Connecticut dated 4 years ago about a local civic dispute involving the rezoning of a historic property. It was not about Cassandra, but her name appeared in the comment section which the search engine had indexed. A comment that said in full, "This property belonged to people who meant something to this community. Some of us remember that, even if others have conveniently forgotten." C. Vale, née Whitmore. Née Whitmore. Born Whitmore. Mara sat in her parked car for a very long time. The engine was off. The radio was off. The tile supplier was going to wonder where she was. None of that seemed particularly relevant. Cassandra Vale had been born with the last name Whitmore. Daniel's last name was Whitmore. His father's name had been Walter Whitmore. She thought about Daniel at the funeral, the tightness around his eyes, the careful way he'd handled the condolences from the small cluster of attendees, none of whom Mara had met before. She thought about how quickly he had wanted to leave afterward, how he'd said there was nothing to sort out, that his father had handled his affairs ahead of time, a phrase she'd taken to mean that Walter had been organized and not let himself become a burden, the mark of a man who planned ahead. She thought about what it actually meant for a man to handle his affairs ahead of time, when he had apparently 2 families. She called the tile supplier and told them she was running late. Then she sat in the car and thought about the word sister. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried immediately. She processed. First, felt, later, which was a quality she appreciated in herself when it was useful, and resented when it left her feeling like she was experiencing her own life from a slight remove. Right now, it was useful. She needed to think before she felt. If Cassandra was Walter Whitmore's daughter, and the comment, the name, the circumstantial architecture of everything she'd gathered over the past month suggested she was, then she was Daniel's half-sister. And if Cassandra had moved into the house directly across the street from Daniel and Mara, that was not coincidence. And if Daniel had been talking to her before the blender day, before Mara had been introduced to her as a new neighbor, then Daniel had known who she was when she knocked on the door. Had possibly known she was coming. Had possibly known she was here specifically because of the Whitmore estate, because of Hargrove and Associates, because of something that Walter had left unresolved when he died, as people with complicated double lives so often do. Mara drove to the tile supplier. She looked at samples. She made decisions about grout lines and subway tile profiles that she knew were correct and that she felt nothing about. She drove home. She made dinner. She sat across from Daniel and watched him eat and talk and be the person he was to her. Affectionate, intelligent, funny in the dry way she had loved about him since the second week they'd known each other. And she felt the distance between what she knew and what he thought she knew settle around them like a layer of new insulation in an old house. Invisible present, changing the temperature of everything without changing anything you could see. She did not ask him. Not that night. She went back to the security camera footage. She had already looked at September. She now went back further to the last 2 weeks of August, the days before Cassandra's moving truck had appeared. If Daniel had known Cassandra was coming, there might have been contact before a visit to the neighborhood. A drive-by, some preparation for an arrival that he had helped engineer, or at least had been informed of. August 29th. Daniel's car left at 7 in the morning, normal. Came home at 5:45, normal. But at 2:18 in the afternoon, while Daniel was presumably at work, a silver sedan she didn't recognize drove slowly past the house, slowed almost to a stop in front of it, then continued down the street. The footage wasn't high enough resolution to read the plates clearly. She could see that the driver was a woman with dark hair. It might have been anyone. She watched it 3 more times. The car slowed in front of their house specifically. Not the gray house, not the neighborhood in general. It slowed here. 4 seconds of almost stopped, and then it pulled away. Mara noted the date. She noted the timestamp. She sat at her office desk until 9 o'clock and then drove home in the dark. And when Daniel asked where she'd been so late, she told him she'd been reviewing material samples at the office and losing track of time, which was something she did often enough that it required no further explanation. And he nodded and heated up the leftover soup she hadn't eaten for dinner and handed her the bowl with a small, easy tenderness that made something in her chest do a thing she couldn't name. She ate the soup. It was very good. He had added herbs she hadn't put in originally, which she did sometimes, quietly improving things she'd made without announcing it. She had always loved that about him. She thought how long. She thought how much. She thought, what is the right question to ask when you've been living 3 weeks in the same house as a secret, and you're not sure if the person keeping it knows how loud silence actually gets? She didn't ask. She washed the bowl. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to Daniel's breathing even out toward sleep. And she thought about the word sister again, turning it over the way she turned over a color choice when she wasn't sure if it was right, looking at it in different lights, against different contexts, trying to see if it would hold. It held. It held so completely and so solidly that she knew with the same certainty she felt when the right solution finally revealed itself in a difficult renovation that this was the answer. Not an affair. Not the smooth, familiar narrative of a man who wanted someone else. Something older. Something that had been here before she'd arrived in Daniel's life, bequeathed to him by a father who had practiced the art of compartmentalization and left the bill for his son to pay. She picked up her phone in the dark and opened the Hargrove and Associates website again. Estate litigation. She had learned in the past 3 weeks from the kind of careful and unlogged research she was becoming practiced at that estate challenges involving out-of-wedlock children had specific legal parameters that an acknowledged child, even one born outside of marriage, had inheritance rights in Pennsylvania under certain conditions, and that those rights could be contested, diminished, or upheld depending on what the deceased had or hadn't documented. Walter Whitmore had handled his affairs ahead of time. The question Mara had not yet answered was whose affairs and in whose favor. She put the phone down. She stared at the ceiling. Beside her, Daniel breathed slowly, the even rhythm of a man who was in this moment genuinely asleep, whatever he was carrying not disturbing him on this particular night. She watched the shadows on the ceiling from the streetlight through the curtains, the way they moved with the wind and the trees outside, and she thought about how a house looked from the outside, complete, settled, lit warmly in the window, and how different it looked when you were inside it, measuring the walls. Something was going to give. It was not a question of if, but of what, and when, and who moved first. She fell asleep at some point without meaning to. In the morning, she made coffee. She stood at the window. The gray house across the street sat quiet in the early light shutters casting their long, thin shadows, and somewhere inside it, Cassandra Vale was probably also making coffee, also standing at a window, also in possession of information that neither of them had yet said out loud. The blender had still not been returned. The confession, that wasn't enough. The night Daniel confessed, it was the first week of December. The maple on their street had been bare for a month. The gray house across the street had its porch light on, which it always did after dark now. A small amber glow that Mara had stopped being able to ignore, even when she wasn't looking for it. They had finished dinner. She was cleaning up. He was at the table with his laptop doing something work-related that she hadn't asked about. The evening had a normal quality, not strained, not warm, just the ambient temperature of two people who had been sharing space long enough that they had stopped needing to perform contentment. The kind of quiet that could mean either depth or distance, depending on what you weren't saying inside it. Mara was at the sink, her back to him when he said her name. Not hey, her full name. Mara. The way he only used it when he was about to say something that mattered. She turned off the water and turned around. He had closed the laptop. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, something halfway between them. The expression of a man who had been rehearsing something in private, and had finally decided that the cost of continuing to rehearse was higher than the cost of saying it. She dried her hands. She sat down across from him at the table. She did not say anything because she had learned in 12 years of marriage that Daniel needed the approach on his own terms, that if you went toward the thing too fast, he would pull back into explanation and logistics and miss the emotional center of what he was trying to say. And she could not afford for him to miss the center of this. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. "Cassandra is my sister," he said. "My half-sister. Same father, different mother. Her mother and my father, they were together on and off for almost 15 years. He kept them separate from everything. I didn't know she existed until after he died." Mara looked at him. She did not move her face. "I knew who she was the day she knocked on our door," he said. "I'm sorry. I knew." The thing about having arrived at the answer before being given it is that the confirmation arrives not as a shock, but as a kind of settling, a click, the sound of a piece going into the place you had already cleared for it. Mara felt the click. She felt the absence of surprise, and then she felt the presence of something else, something larger and heavier, which was the understanding that knowing she'd been right didn't actually make anything easier. "Tell me from the beginning," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. He told her. He'd been contacted by Hargrove and Associates 8 days after his father's funeral, a letter. The letter in the desk drawer informing him that Walter Whitmore had a second daughter, whose existence had been disclosed in a codicil to the will. The codicil named Cassandra and provided for her financially, but Daniel, as the primary heir, had the legal right to challenge the codicil's legitimacy if he chose. Hargrove and Associates had been hired by Cassandra, or so the letter implied, to communicate with Daniel and negotiate a path forward. In the weeks that followed, Daniel said he'd had a series of phone calls with Hargrove, Marcus Hargrove directly, not a junior associate, and had learned more about Cassandra's situation. She had grown up knowing her father's name, but not his face, had spent most of her life being told that acknowledgement was coming, that Walter would eventually formalize the relationship, that she would eventually be recognized. He had died before he'd done it properly, and the codicil was his attempt, too late and too thin, to make good on something he'd deferred for decades. During those phone calls, Daniel said Hargrove had suggested that meeting Cassandra in person might help resolve the situation more effectively than purely legal communication. And sometime in late August, Hargrove had told him that Cassandra had found a rental property near their neighborhood. He'd phrased it as coincidence, Daniel said, but it had felt less like coincidence even at the time. "You didn't tell me," Mara said. "I didn't tell you. When she knocked on our door, when you were standing in this kitchen, watching me hand her a box with a blender in it. You knew." "I knew." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed. "Why?" He looked at his hands. "Because I didn't know how to tell you that my father spent 15 years running 2 lives, and I was one of the things in the first one. Because I didn't know how to tell you that I knew and had known for months, and that I'd been managing something I should have shared with you from the start. Because every time I tried to find the right point to begin, I realized that beginning meant telling you everything. And everything was—" He stopped. "A lot," Mara said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her, not flinching from it, which she appreciated even now, even through everything. Daniel had never been the kind of man who looked away from the hard parts. He just sometimes approached them too late. "What does Cassandra want?" Mara asked. He was quiet. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know she thought, but the quiet of someone who wasn't sure how much of what he knew was accurate. "The estate," he said carefully. "What she's legally owed. Her share of the Whitmore assets. That's what Hargrove says she wants." "That's what, yes." He hesitated. Mara recognized that hesitation. It was the hesitation of a man who had accepted information at face value, and had only now, in the act of repeating it to someone else, noticed that he hadn't verified it. She let the hesitation sit. She didn't fill it. "There's something else," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. "She said once, in one of our conversations, she said what she really wanted was for me to look at her like a person, not like a problem. She said nobody in my father's life had ever done that." Mara was quiet for a while. She watched the porch light of the gray house through the kitchen window, the amber glow, steady and small. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said I didn't know how to do that yet, that I was trying." Mara stood up. She went to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the gray house at the light. She thought about a woman in a linen shirt, standing in her entryway, asking to borrow a blender, her eyes sliding to the family photographs on the wall, and staying there a beat too long. She thought about what it would feel like to stand in the house of the life your father had chosen over yours, and look at the evidence of it framed on the wall. She turned around. "Who hired Hargrove?" she asked. Daniel looked at her. "Cassandra." "Are you sure?" He opened his mouth, closed it. Mara picked up her bag from the chair and found the small notebook she'd been carrying for 2 months. She turned to the page. Hargrove and Associates. Estate litigation. She thought about the letter Cassandra's lawyer reaching out to Daniel, the primary heir, to negotiate. She thought about something she'd read 3 weeks ago in a legal overview of Pennsylvania state law, that in contested cases involving claims from out-of-wedlock heirs, a common strategy was to create marital instability for the primary heir, since certain provisions tied to the heir's domestic status could be used to accelerate or complicate the distribution of assets. She thought about Daniel's father and the specific language of a man who had handled his affairs ahead of time and left, deliberately or not, a situation that required everyone around him to navigate in the dark. "I need you to listen to me carefully," Mara said. She sat back down. "I think Cassandra didn't hire Hargrove. I think Hargrove came to Cassandra. And I think the reason they directed her here to this neighborhood at this time was not entirely for her benefit." Daniel stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to look at your father's will. The full will, not just the codicil. And I want to know exactly what conditions are attached to your inheritance." He was very still. "Why would conditions—" Because estate attorneys who specialize in litigation don't take cases for the benefit of under-resourced claimants, Mara said. They take cases because there's a profitable angle. And the most profitable angle in a contested estate isn't the claimant winning more. It's the primary heir losing their claim, which can be triggered by specific conditions, which might include, and I need to see the actual document to know something related to the status of the heir's marriage. The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. Not the ambient silence of a normal evening. The silence of a room where something has just been understood. Daniel looked at her for a long time. "You've been looking," she said. "Yes, for 2 months." He let out a breath. It was not quite a laugh. "Because of course you have. I need to see the will, Daniel." He got up. He went to his office. He came back with an envelope. A different envelope than the one she had seen in the drawer. Newer, from a folder he'd apparently kept separately. He put it on the table between them. Mara opened it and read. She read carefully, methodically, the way she read every important document from the beginning, rather than skipping to the relevant part, because context mattered, and the things that looked unimportant were sometimes the ones that changed everything. She found it on page 7 of 12, a provision buried in a subsection regarding the distribution timeline that specified the inheritance would transfer in full only upon confirmation of the primary heir's marital stability, defined as uninterrupted legal marriage, at the point of final estate settlement. In the event that the primary heir's marital status changed prior to settlement, separation, divorce, or documented marital breakdown, the estate would enter a secondary distribution process in which additional claimants could file for increased allocations. Mara set the document down. "Hargrove isn't working for Cassandra," she said. "He's working against you, and Cassandra doesn't know." Daniel looked at the document. His face had gone the particular still that it went when he was running calculations when the numbers of a situation were changing faster than the meaning had caught up. "My father wrote this." "Your father, or someone who advised him to. It doesn't matter right now." Mara stood up. She picked up her bag. "I'm going across the street." "Mara, she's being used. She deserves to know." She paused at the kitchen doorway. She looked back at him, the man she had been married to for 8 years, the man who had sat with a secret for 14 months rather than trust her with it, the man who looked at her now with something in his face that she recognized as love, complicated and inadequate and completely genuine. "We are not done with this conversation. You understand that?" "I understand," he said. She went across the street. She knocked on the door of the gray house, and Cassandra answered it after a moment in a sweatshirt, barefoot, holding a glass of wine. And whatever she had expected from a late December knock on her door, it was clearly not Mara. Her expression went through several things, quickly, surprise, wariness, a flash of something that might have been relief, or might have been preparation. "Can I come in?" Mara asked. Cassandra looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. The interior of the gray house was sparse, in the way of someone who had never fully committed to a space furniture that was functional, rather than chosen boxes still unpacked and stacked against the hallway wall, the particular provisional quality of a person who had learned not to nest too deeply, because the depth was never guaranteed. Mara took this in automatically, the professional habit of reading a room before the people in it, and felt something shift in her understanding of Cassandra Vale in a way she hadn't expected. She had prepared herself for an adversary. She had prepared herself for a woman who was calculating and deliberate, who had come to this neighborhood with clear intentions and had executed them with the smooth skill of someone who had done this kind of thing before. She had not prepared herself for the quality of impermanence in this hallway, for the boxes that said, "Someone who hasn't trusted a place enough to unpack yet," for the single photograph visible on the window ledge of the living room, a woman who might have been Cassandra's mother, younger, standing in a garden, looking at the camera with an expression of such specific and tired dignity that it stopped Mara's breath for a moment. Cassandra led her into the kitchen. It was the only room that was fully unpacked. Mara's blender sat on the counter, she noticed, plugged in, used.
You want something?
Cassandra asked. Coffee, water? No, thank you. Mara sat at the kitchen table without being invited to. Cassandra sat across from her, still holding the wine glass, her feet tucked up on the chair rung, and watched Mara with the contained, careful attention of someone who had learned to wait for the thing before reacting to it. Daniel told me tonight, Mara said. He told me who you are. Something in Cassandra's face moved, a brief thing quickly controlled. Okay, she said. What he didn't tell me, because I don't think he knows, is that Marcus Hargrove is not your attorney. Or not primarily your attorney. And that your being here in this neighborhood, at this address, at this particular time, I don't think that was your idea. Cassandra was very still. Her hand had tightened on the wine glass slightly, the knuckles going pale. What do you mean? Mara set her notebook on the table, open to the relevant page. Your father's will has a provision that keeps Daniel from fully inheriting if his marriage becomes unstable before the estate is settled. Hargrove's firm specializes in exploiting exactly those kinds of provisions. Their fee structure in contested estate cases is based on a percentage of whatever they recover from the primary heir's allocation. If they can demonstrate marital breakdown, they trigger a secondary distribution process, and whatever comes out of Daniel's allocation, a portion of that comes to them. Cassandra looked at the notebook. Her face had gone the particular white that wasn't pallor from illness, but from a body that has stopped spending energy on warmth because it needs all of it for something else. He told me, she said slowly, that living here would help build my case. That proximity and documentation of Daniel's acknowledgement of our relationship would strengthen my claim. That I needed to. She stopped. He told you what you needed to do to get what you wanted, Mara said. And what he needed you to do happened to be the same thing. Cassandra set the wine glass down. She looked at the table. He said my father's will was unfair to me. He said Daniel would fight me if I went through normal channels. He said... A pause. When she looked up, there was something in her face that Mara hadn't seen before. A quality of someone hearing the specific echo of a logic that had felt sound and was only now revealing its seams. He said the best approach was to establish a relationship with Daniel first. Make it personal. If Daniel already had a relationship with me, it would be harder for him to contest my claim in court. That's true, Mara said. It's also true that a personal relationship between you and Daniel, if it destabilized his marriage, would serve Hargrove's interests equally well, possibly more. Cassandra looked at her for a long moment. You think I was being used. I think you were given accurate information in a specific sequence that made a particular course of action seem obvious. And I think whoever designed that sequence had a different primary interest than yours. I'm not stupid, Cassandra said, and the words came out with an edge that Mara recognized not anger at Mara, but the particular fury of intelligence that has been outmaneuvered. I know you're not, Mara said. I think that's why it worked. It takes intelligence to get someone to follow a logic. Easier to dupe someone who isn't thinking. Harder to dupe someone who thinks they've already done the thinking. Cassandra was quiet. Outside, the wind moved in the bare trees. The kitchen was very still, and the porch light through the window made a small amber pool on the table between them. I do have a claim, Cassandra said. Her voice was different now, lower, stripped of the practiced sociability. Whatever Hargrove's angle is, I'm still his daughter. Walter Whitmore is still my father. I have a right to be in that estate. Yes, Mara said. You do. Cassandra looked at her. The wariness in her face was mixed now with something she was clearly working to keep controlled. Something wet and hot that was not going to make it entirely. And Daniel? She asked. Is the person you'd have to talk to about what kind of relationship you want from this. I can't answer that for him. Mara paused. But I don't think you came here to destroy his marriage. I think you came here because you wanted to be seen. Those are very different things. Cassandra looked at the table. A long silence. The blender, she said finally, with a short, almost involuntary sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He told me to find a reason, something ordinary. He said it couldn't look like I already knew you. She glanced at the counter at the blender. I almost didn't do it. I stood at the door for 8 minutes before I knocked. I counted. Mara looked at the blender on the counter. I know, she said. I was on a deadline and I was glad to have it out of my cabinet. The almost laugh came back, and this time it was more real. Then Mara said, I need you to help me with Hargrove. Cassandra looked up. I need documentation, Mara said. His communications with you, his specific instructions about proximity, and what you were supposed to do or say, his framing of what the estate provision meant and what your options were. I think there's a case that he misrepresented the estate's terms to you in order to manufacture a situation that would benefit him at your expense, which would mean you were being defrauded as much as anyone else in this. Cassandra's expression shifted through several things. You want to go after Hargrove. I want to get you what you're actually owed, and I want to make sure the person who decided to use you as a mechanism for that gets to account for it. Mara met her eyes. And I think your claim against the Whitmore estate is stronger if it's not tangled up in a scheme that a good defense attorney could use to cast doubt on your motives. Silence. The wind. The amber light. Why? Cassandra asked, not combative, genuinely asking. You don't owe me anything. I came into your street and you're... I know, Mara said. I know exactly what you did and how my husband handled it. We're going to have to work through that separately, and it's going to be hard, and I'm not pretending otherwise. She paused. But I've spent 2 months watching a situation that was designed by someone else, and building toward a conclusion that none of the people inside it actually chose. I'm not interested in letting that stand. Cassandra looked at her for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for, she apparently found, because she uncurled her feet from the chair rung, stood up, and went to the cabinet over the refrigerator and took down a laptop. I have everything, she said. Every email, every call summary, I wrote down after every document he sent me. I kept records because... She sat back down, opened the laptop. I always keep records. Growing up the way I grew up, you learn to keep records. Mara looked at the screen as it lit up. Show me. They met with Hargrove 2 days later, on a Thursday at his office on the 14th floor of a downtown Philadelphia building that communicated through its marble lobby and its leather furniture and its heavy-framed diplomas, an authority that was designed to make visitors feel like the smaller party before anyone had said a word. Mara had been in many rooms designed to make her feel small. She had learned through years of telling clients what their spaces were actually communicating that the performance of authority was not the same as authority, and that the gap between the two was where most of the real work happened. Hargrove sat behind his desk and looked at Mara and Cassandra with the specific kind of composed attention that expensive attorneys develop neither warmth nor hostility, just the controlled neutrality of a man who has decided nothing until he understands what he's looking at. Ms. Vale, he said, and... He looked at Mara. Mara Whitmore, Mara said. Daniel's wife. A very brief shift in Hargrove's composure, so brief that if she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. I see. Ms. Whitmore, this is an unusual meeting. You understand that I represent the interests of my client, and that anything discussed in this office... I'd like to ask you about the estate provision on page 7 of the Whitmore will, Mara said. The marital stability clause. Hargrove's composure did not break. He was too good for that. But something tightened in the jaw, in the placement of his hands which had been relaxed on the desk, and now were not quite relaxed. That's a matter of estate law, that. Did you explain that provision to Ms. Vale when she first came to you? Mara asked. Did you explain that your fee structure in this case is based on a percentage of any assets redistributed from the primary heir's allocation? And did you explain the specific circumstances under which that redistribution would be triggered? The terms of my... Because Ms. Vale has records, Mara said, of your correspondence, of your instructions regarding her proximity to Daniel, of your specific framing of what her options were. She set a folder on the desk. Not the originals. She had made copies and sent one to an attorney she had contacted the day after her conversation with Cassandra. What I'm asking is whether you'd like to have a conversation now or later about whether the advice you gave my husband's half-sister constituted misrepresentation, about whether directing a client to take specific actions that primarily served your financial interests while framing those actions as being in her interests constitutes something the Pennsylvania Bar would find interesting, and about whether this meeting is more productive now before any of that becomes a formal inquiry, or later when it does. The silence in the room was the specific silence of a man who is running a calculation that is not coming out the way he expected. Hargrove looked at Cassandra. "You came here with documentation." "I came here with documentation," Cassandra said. Her voice was even. Mara had watched her find this evenness over the past 2 days, had watched the process of a woman rearranging her understanding of a situation she'd been inside for months, and had found herself deeply, unexpectedly admiring it. "The Whitmore estate is valued at," Hargrove began. "I know what it's valued at," Mara said. "And I know what Cassandra Vale is entitled to under Pennsylvania inheritance law when a biological relationship is acknowledged even informally in the testator's documents, which it is in the codicil. What she's not entitled to is having someone engineer a situation designed to increase her potential payout by engineering the collapse of her brother's marriage. And what you're not entitled to is a percentage of an outcome you manufactured." Hargrove looked at her for a long time. The diplomas on the wall looked down at all of them equally. The leather furniture made no comment. "What is it you want, Ms. Whitmore?" he said. "I want Cassandra Vale's legitimate inheritance claim processed through proper channels, with an estate attorney who represents her interests, not his own. I want your firm's involvement in this matter ended by the end of this week, and I want documentation that you've communicated this to all relevant parties." She paused. "In exchange for which the records Ms. Vale has provided me are used only if you make that difficult." It was not the last shot fired in the room. Hargrove pushed back. He denied the characterization suggested that his communications with Cassandra were entirely within professional bounds, threatened that any attempt to involve the bar would be countered with a defamation claim. At one point, directed his full professional authority toward Cassandra specifically, and said, with a controlled patience that was designed to feel like patience and actually felt like pressure, "Ms. Vale, you came to me. I advised you within the limits of what I understood your goals to be. If you feel I misrepresented anything, that's a serious claim that I'd encourage you to consider very carefully before pursuing." Cassandra looked at him for a moment. Mara watched her and did not speak because this was Cassandra's moment to navigate, not hers. "What I feel," Cassandra said with a precision that was controlled and cold, in the specific way of someone who has learned that cold is safer than hot, "is that you described a course of action to me that you told me was for my benefit, while you had information I didn't have about how it would benefit you. I feel that's a distinction worth making. I feel that a bar review board would also find it a distinction worth making." She glanced at Mara, then back to Hargrove. "I also feel that I've spent my whole life being in situations where the person with the information decided how much of it to give me. I'm done with that." The silence after this was different from the earlier silence. It was the silence after something has actually landed. Hargrove picked up his pen. He looked at the folder on his desk. "I'll need until Monday," he said. "Thursday," Mara said. He looked at her. "Thursday," she said again, not loudly. She had found in many years of client negotiations that calm repetition was considerably more effective than escalation, because escalation gave the other party somewhere to go. Hargrove set the pen down. "Thursday," he agreed. Mara and Cassandra stood on the sidewalk outside the building afterward in the cold December air, the city moving around them with its usual indifference to individual outcomes. Cassandra's hands were in the pockets of her coat. She looked at the building's facade for a moment, then at the street. "That went better than I expected," Cassandra said. "Mostly," Mara said. "He's not done. He'll try something before Thursday, but he'll do it through back channels, and now he knows we're watching back channels. Cassandra nodded slowly. What happens to my claim? After. You get an attorney who actually works for you. The codicil gives you a legitimate basis. It won't be Walter's entire estate, but it will be something real, and it will be yours without someone else's thumb on the scale. Mara paused. That's the legal answer? And the other answer? Mara looked at her. That depends on what you and Daniel figure out how to be to each other. I can't give you that answer. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. He called me, she said, 2 nights ago, after you went back. He didn't know what to say, really. We talked for about 20 minutes, and most of it was quiet, but it was... She stopped, started again. It was the first time we talked, like we weren't managing something. That's a start, Mara said. Cassandra looked at her with the measuring quality Mara had noticed from the very beginning, from the doorstep, from the blender day. You're very direct, Cassandra said. I design spaces for people, Mara said. You learn quickly that there's no point in building around what's actually there. You have to start from the real structure. Cassandra almost smiled. I'll figure out how to return the blender properly, she said. Mara looked at her. Keep it, she said. I was going to donate it anyway. She drove home in the early dark of December, the city giving way to the quieter roads of the suburb, the bare trees lining the street, catching the headlights and letting them go. She was tired in a specific way, not physically, but in the way of a long project that had required sustained attention, the fatigue that came from holding something complicated in mind for weeks and finally setting it down. Daniel's car was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. The porch light of the gray house across the street was on the amber glow that had watched over all of this from the beginning. She went inside. He was at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, which meant he had been watching for her headlights. She took off her coat and her bag and sat across from him, the same chairs, the same table, where he had told her the truth 3 days ago, and she had stood up and walked out to do something about it. They looked at each other. Hargrove is out by Thursday, she said. Cassandra's going to retain independent counsel. Her claim is legitimate, and it'll go through proper channels. Daniel nodded slowly. He wrapped his hands around his tea. And you? Me, she said. Mara. He looked at her. I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it, without the version where I manage the saying of it. Can I? She looked at him. She nodded. I knew when I got that letter 14 months ago that the right thing to do was tell you immediately. And I didn't, because I was afraid. Not afraid of Cassandra, not afraid of the estate, afraid of what you'd think of me, of the family you were marrying into, that you didn't know you were marrying into, of the version of my father that would require me to explain, and the version of myself that had known about it and said nothing for decades because it was easier not to deal with it. He paused. I made it a secret because I'd been taught that secrets were how you protected people, and I understand now that protecting someone by keeping them in the dark isn't protection. It's just control with better intentions. Mara looked at him. The tea was warm in her hands. Outside, the December dark pressed against the kitchen window, and across the street, the amber light was steady. You understand now, she said. I understand now. And before now? He was quiet for a moment. I was working on it, he said, slower than I should have been. She set her tea down. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the refrigerator hummed and the house made its small, settling sounds, the sounds that a house makes when it has been lived in long enough that it has its own vocabulary. I'm not leaving, she said. I want to be clear about that because I think you've been carrying that possibility for the past 3 days, and I don't want it to be in the room anymore. That's not what this is. Something in Daniel's face changed. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a tension that had been held so long it had started to feel like structure. Okay, he said quietly, but I need you to understand that I spent 2 months finding information that you already had, Mara said. I need you to understand what it felt like to do that. Not what it meant about your intentions. I understand your intentions. What it felt like to be in this house, to be your wife, to be the person you trusted most, and also the person you trusted last with this. I understand, he said. Say it back to me, she said. Not the summary, the specifics. He held her gaze. This was what she had always loved about him. Underneath everything, that when she asked him to be fully present, he came fully present, even when it cost him something. You were gathering information that I had and watching me not give it to you, he said slowly. You were doing the work of figuring out the truth in the same house where I was living with the truth already. And that's something I took from you, that I didn't have the right to take. Your ability to make decisions with full information about your own life. Yes, she said. I'm sorry. I know. They sat for a while. The tea cooled. The house settled. Somewhere in the December dark outside, the city was doing what cities do, moving and humming and producing the distant, ambient proof of other lives, other rooms, other people, sitting across tables from the person they had chosen and trying to figure out how to say the true thing in a way the other person could actually hear. I want to try, Mara said finally. I want to try the version where we're honest with each other, from the actual beginning of things, not the curated version. I don't know if we can do that. I think we have to find out. I think so too, Daniel said. And Cassandra, Mara said. She's going to be part of this. Not in the middle of this. She's going to need to build something separate with you, whatever that is. And I'm not going to manage it. But she exists, and I'm not interested in pretending she doesn't. Daniel looked at his hands for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression had the quality she associated with him making a decision that he meant, not one he was performing. I called her 2 nights ago, he said. She told me. I didn't know what to say, but I think I need to learn how. Then learn, Mara said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, the 2 cups of cooling tea between them, the December dark at the window, the amber light across the street, steady and small as it had been since the beginning. He reached across the table. She looked at his hand for a moment, at the familiar shape of it, the hand she had held in a hospital waiting room and at a graveside in Connecticut, and through 14 ordinary years of days that had required nothing from them except to show up and be honest, which turned out to be the hardest thing. She took his hand. We're starting over, she said. From the real structure, he said, and she recognized her own words in his mouth and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. From the real structure, she agreed. Outside, a light came on in the upstairs window of the gray house. The blender that Mara had told Cassandra to keep sat on a counter across the street, in a kitchen that was the only fully unpacked room in a house of provisional boxes. And Cassandra Vale stood at her own window for a moment, looking out at the dark street and the amber porch light and the warm-lit square of the kitchen window across the way. And whatever she felt in that moment was hers entirely. The first thing in a long time that no one had designed for her. The following Monday, Cassandra left a small note in Mara's mailbox. It said, I found a new attorney. Thank you. I'm sorry about the blender. I know you said to keep it, but I think some things should be returned properly. I'll find you something to replace it, something you'll actually use. Mara read it at the kitchen counter with her coffee going warm in her hand, and she stood at the window for a moment and looked at the gray house with the bad shutters, at the morning light catching the front walk, at the bare trees and the quiet street, and she thought about what it meant to borrow something and what it meant to return it, and what it meant when what you gave back was not the same shape as what you'd taken, but was in some important way better. She thought, this is what it looks like afterward. Not clean, not resolved into something simple, just the real structure visible, something you could actually build from. She drank her coffee. She went back to work.